No, just
Hold on. You got to do this right, Catherine. I have to feel nervous.
Still so formal. It's just like a suggestion. Not a suggestion, it's just like something that I'm curious.
Okay, ask away.
So do you choose the materials that you teach for this course?
Yeah, I choose all the materials for this course.
So, so you want to concentrate on only the classics?
Well, I choose materials based on, first of all, materials that I'm familiar with. That's part of it. So materials I've read in the past. Not everything, but some texts that I'm comfortable with. So those become kind of foundation texts in the course. But the other reason I choose materials is kind of the opposite. It's because I'm curious about things that I haven't read. And so I try to bring in other materials to kind of make the class interesting for me in a way that I'm not just repeating things that I've done before. So a balance between those two.
So, so will you consider adding like modern like novels into the course?
More modern stuff instead
like,
of just the older stuff, like the Shakespeare and the...
Yeah, and more easy texts, like texts that are more interesting, which many students may be familiar with, like, you know, just the modern stuff like New York Times bestseller.
Yeah, part of the problem in the course and in planning is that you kind of get caught up in more detail than you expect from the beginning, and so we kind of run out of time. I did want to do more modern texts. There were several poems and modern novels that I wanted to spend more time on. So it was because we were going chronologically, it took more time. And as relates to the question about easier texts, I think difficult texts are important to struggle with. Now, I understand that we're a class of second language speakers, even though you guys are a pretty high level. And so maybe sometimes it's good to kind of lower the level a little bit. But what I try to do as a teacher is kind of take excerpts from difficult texts that we can then do very close reading. That one real essential skill of close reading is what I was going for. And so I think you have to have difficult texts to do that.
You think that more classical text would help students more in cultivating their literary skills than modern texts, like simple texts?
I would say it's fair. Your question is a great question. I would say it's fair that I concentrated too much on those texts. And probably next year I'll do less of that. But yeah, I think, like, for example, the sonnet as a literary form is a really, really useful, like, trying to analyze, understanding how a sonnet is structured, and then analyzing meaning and wordplay in a sonnet. Although 95% of English speakers, native English speakers, will never read a sonnet in their lives. The mental puzzle, the exercise of going through that and understanding it, whether the vocabulary is a little dated or not, I think is an absolutely useful exercise. Any sort of mental gymnastics that you can put your brain through, even if it's a little antiquated language-wise, absolutely useful. No question.
So you think that clarity here is that's important?
What do you mean by clarity?
Clarity means like comprehending text in a easy way, or like approaching more relatable texts, like readings. But you know, according to my opinion, it's like easy. It is easy to understand literature if you read something that are more modern. That's something that you could relate with.
No question. Like, I mean, our discussions about, like, the kind of the zeitgeist and postmodernism as a kind of style of writing, it's absolutely easier to understand that because that's where we're living right now. And so we're constantly influenced by that in our daily lives, and not just the literature. But I think it's always useful to have a kind of historical context, and that's partly what we study in this class. Is literature and history are kind of sister disciplines. And so when you're studying older literature, you're really kind of studying history and context, right? Like the whole idea of the metanarrative, something that, defined the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, these larger sort of unifying ideas. I think it's absolutely useful to look at those, because then it makes you more aware of the metanarrative that you dwell in, where you're living right now. And it makes it possible for you to be able to be critical of the metanarrative you're part of right now. So yeah.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Ken? Barry, you have a question? Excellent.
You want to introduce more about like terms we might study in poems, so like rhymes and like patterns. So like for example, like pentamic,
iambic pentameter.
Iambic pentameter sort of stuff.
Do I want to, or do you think I should?
Do you want to?
Not so much. Like I think Latin expressions for rhyme and rhythm. I don't think are that essential. I think it's useful because we didn't spend that much time on it. Like if you remember, I think Odelet had to ask about all of the different forms, because really we had only looked at a couple in class. And so, no, I don't think I'm not that interested in introducing a lot of archaic Latin terminology into the course, because that's probably not very useful at all for you guys. But just to know that there are one or two of those forms and how they work, and that's how they used to do it, as I said, is a kind of, so you can understand the whole kind of puzzle. I think it's useful.
Do you think the course should be like task-oriented or like interest-oriented?
Well, that's a big question. I think assessment is important. I'm not a huge fan of standardized testing. I think like one big test, each term is useful to kind of just collect everything that we've been looking at and see if you can kind of organize it in an interesting way in your essay answers. I think that's useful, but I think the course should focus on things that are interesting. I think it's almost kind of like two questions you're asking. I think being in a class where things are interesting and being in a class where you're studying things that are maybe not very interesting but are useful for you to go through the process of understanding. I know it's a common objection, like students want to be interested. But education is not always about being entertained or finding, the process of learning things an easy one or a pleasurable one. Often it's boring. Often going through all kinds of material is like the specifics. There's an expression, the devil is in the details. It's true. And we are so distracted. Remember the video that we watched, right? The Ken Robinson video? We live in an extremely exciting time, all kinds of stuff on our digital devices. And so being interested in a class is much more of a challenge today than it's ever been in the history of, of being human.
Because literature is kind of broad, it's like there are various books about
Well,
you don't know what is going beyond the tests.
Literature is analytical in a way that a lot of disciplines are not. Literature demands of the student that they come up with reasonable and, if possible, creative interpretations of text, individual interpretations of text. You're rewarded for that. And so, yeah, there's a lot of room for movement out there. It's I would say, one of the more difficult disciplines to test with a standardized test. But I don't think I answered Barry's question yet.
No, I think so. They want to know if you have more focus just in the test, or in general, it's really, really interesting to learn about the literature.
For me,
not just focus in the test because they must to pass the test.
the test, right?
Yeah.
Not
this
just.
is your question, yeah.
Yeah, sort of.
For me, what I want is just to make it interesting. The concepts I try to introduce in class, I try to come up with, for example, romanticizing the dead body sort of thing, stuff like that. I try to come up with things that are kind of make it kind of turn your head, that's kind of weird. So for me, I definitely want to make it interesting, because when it's interesting for you guys, it's interesting for me. Like there's an exchange. When there's a genuine curiosity to understand some weird concept, then for me that's the most important thing. And assessment is important, but again, like what Catherine was saying, it's really difficult to assess in literature. And I think what's really important is to just kind of engage with the language.